Hello and welcome to this epic battle in the Jobava London System chess opening. And this took place a month ago in the Norway chess tournament in May of 2025. And very interesting game between two of the best players on the planet, Magnus Carlsen and the current world champion Gukesh Damaraju. So you may have seen this game already, and spoiler alert: Magnus Carlsen wins this game, but it is so valuable what we can learn from this game. Let's check it out and see how the top players in the world play the Jobava London system. So I'll turn on a quick game review, and we'll see that Magnus Carlsen played with 98.6% accuracy versus 92.3% by the world champion. And the game was pretty much even the entire way into the end game here, where the world champion faltered. And let's see what happened. So, also something to note is that Magnus has been playing blitz games and rapid games mostly since he gave up his world championship title. And this is one of the few games where he plays in standard time controls, where they have time to think and really dig into this game. So let's see what happens. I'm going to turn on the computer analysis, and let's take a look. So the game begins with d4, knight to f6. Now in the Jobava London, they can also play d5, and it transposes into this right here, where we have the Jobava London setup. And I guess the original name for this was Queen's Pawn Opening Shigorin variation, based off of the top world player, I believe Mikhail Shigorin, from about 100 years ago, maybe, or more. All right. So in the Jobava London, you play d4. Usually at some point your opponent will play d5 to prevent you from bringing both pawns into the center, because then they can just capture. But the move orders can change up a little bit. Sometimes when you play d4, the opponent could play knight to f6 first and then d5. But the standard Jobava London system is a d4 pawn, a knight to c3, instead of knight to d2 in the regular London system. Here the knight is a little more active. You have possibilities of jumping up here and attacking, threatening a fork of the king and the rook, and the bishop is lining up on this pawn. So in order to take care of that, we have, a counterattack in the center. Now, if the knight were to jump up here immediately and target this, then knight to a6 could be played, stopping that potential fork. So Gukesh, he immediately counter strikes in the center. And now we have e3, another standard move in the Jobava, where you fortify this central d4 pawn. You also have the possibility of moving this bishop to d3, or sometimes e2, as happens in this game. So let's see how it continues. And this is an interesting move here, where the knight is attacking the queen, and often f3 can be played, and then you have a counterattack, chasing this bishop back and maybe gaining space on the king side for a king side attack. But Magnus Carlsen, he plays this a little differently. He offers a trade of the bishops, and the best move is played by Gukesh, capturing, and then we have an interesting recapture with this knight. You would think that the other knight would maybe capture, or the queen, but this move gets out of the way of the c pawn, where it can push forward potentially and bolster the central d4 pawn. Now the knight will probably go to f3, so let's see how things continue. Knight is developed. Magnus develops his knight. And now we have e6 being played, unleashing the dark squared bishop, which often, can just go here, countering white's dark squared bishop. But also the bishop is protecting this pawn in case white decides to capture at some point. So Magnus fortifies his central d4 pawn. And now the bishop is developed just enough to allow castling, but Gukesh decides not to trade his good bishop on the opposite colored squares as his two central pawns. He does not trade that with Magnus's bad bishop, which is blocked by his central pawns. So the game continues with a knight move here by Magnus. You'd think maybe an ordinary move would be to castle. The computer also recommends bishop up to g5, targeting the knight, and also if that knight moves, attacking, possibly trading off the bishop. All right, let's continue here. So castling by black. Magnus decides not to castle. He brings his queen forward. So let's see how things continue here. We have h6, giving the king some breathing room. Also a potential push, attacking the bishop. Then, maybe pushing forward, attacking the knight. But that could weaken black's king side. So now we have Magnus centralizing his rook. The queen attacks the now unprotected pawn, so Magnus pushes that forward, taking care of that. And the game continues with rook centralizing, countering Magnus's rook on the d file, because you never know when the center could open up, and then a battle for that open file will take place with the rooks. Now, it's interesting that Magnus decides not to castle. The game continues with h4, gaining space on the king side, preventing a future, or slowing down, well, at the moment, preventing this pawn push, because then you would have capture, and then the bishop or knight could capture here. So, this is also a move that's common in the Jobava London, and we see this a lot more often. The computer likes these h-pawn and a-pawn pushes, gaining space on the flanks. So now the game continues with the queen trying to work its way into the position, perhaps. Also, maybe covering here, lining up on the bishop as well. If there's an exchange at some point, and the bishop would then be possibly not protected. All right, continuing on, we have the knight jumping into the outpost on e5. So what does Gukesh do? He immediately gets rid of that knight, the best move in the position. And at this point, the game is pretty much even. A slight edge for black, probably because this rook is still sitting in the corner here, not doing much. Although, now that this h-pawn is pushed forward, maybe at some point this rook could move up and try and line up on the king. Or if things open here, you could have a future attack up the h-file. So, capture, knight drops back to target the bishop. Magnus does not want to trade the bishop for that knight, so he drops back. And now we have the queen repositioning, lining up on Magnus's queen, offering a trade here. And it looks like the best move would be to go ahead and capture, doubling up these pawns on the A file, but then temporarily leaving Magnus with a backwards pawn here. That pawn could push forward, perhaps. So now Magnus declines the trade of queens, wanting to, keep opportunities for a win alive. The more pieces that are traded, the more likely you would have a draw. But now the game is dead even, according to the computer analysis. So the game continues with bishops lining up on one another. Magnus ignores that, presses his knight forward, aiming at the world champion's king side. And so we continue here with a trade of bishops. Gukesh giving up his good bishop for Magnus's bad bishop. And you'll see this type of trading down, even if it's unnecessary, when you have one player playing against a higher rated player and wanting to trade off material, almost going for a draw from the start. And, maybe that's what Gukesh was trying to do here, just go for a draw. And if you watch this tournament, there was another game where Gukesh wins in a time scramble at the end, even though Magnus was ahead. It was a crazy game, where Magnus slammed the table, got emotional, but immediately apologized for that to Gukesh. But in this game, Magnus, of course, wins. Let's see how he did it. Okay, we have the recapture. Now Gukesh presses forward, attacking the queen. This is an inaccuracy according to the computer. But, instead of capturing there, it says that D takes E5 would be best. He first goes for the immediate checkmate in one possibility, but of course that is blocked. And now we do have a trade of queens. The knight is under attack, so that knight drops back. We have pawn exchange in the center, and Gukesh gains space on the queen side here by pushing that pawn and kind of fixing this backwards pawn here. So the knight repositions. The pawns are pushing forward on the queen side. At this point, white has a slight edge. He places his knight on a good square here, the best move in the position, and basically forks two pawns. So will one of them fall? Let's continue here. And now we have knight repositioning, also the best move. And instead of capturing here, because then the knight could be attacked and then a recapture, Magnus guards his pawn. Gukesh does likewise. And now this pawn push prevents Gukesh's knight from jumping forward. So the game continues with pawns pushing forward on the queen side. Magnus pushes forward also. And then after a capture en passant, we have a rook capture. Pawn pushes forward, the exchange. And now Magnus avoids the trade of rooks, which would allow the pawn to capture and chase the knight, and that pawn would be further up the board. So this is where things get a little bit tricky on both sides. So the game continues with rook centralizing, lining up on the king and the pawn here on e3. So now the king comes forward. And apparently king to f2 would have been better, guarding this g pawn. But instead, Magnus goes the other way, probably trying to prepare to stop this passed pawn. So now we have check. King centralizes, capture, and capture. So at this point, the game is dead even once again, and things continue with rook attacking this unprotected pawn. The rook defends, and now an attack here. So Gukesh is trying to trade off these pawns. Apparently, it still looks like he's going for a possible draw here, but Gukesh does have this passed pawn on the H file. So once again, the computer says the game is dead even. Things continue with the rooks doubling on the A file. The passed pawn is starting to move down the board, and now Magnus offers a trade of rooks. Gukesh accepts, and now we have a check. The king, makes the best move here, kind of jumping into the corner here behind the pawn. And so things continue with an attack in the center, capture, recapture, and now Magnus has a pair of passed pawns in the center. Now at this point, the game is dead even because Gukesh has these two passed pawns on the flank. The furthest passed pawn starts marching forward. Magnus decides to ignore that, attacks the knight. This pawn keeps pushing. We have a capture of the knight. The pawn is one square away from promotion. And now Magnus's pawn is as well. So, interestingly enough, the game is still dead even according to the computer. So, we have a check. King moves to the best square. Pawn promotes to a queen on both sides of the board. And now things get interesting. The first mistake of the game, played by Gukesh, he drops back with a check, but the computer doesn't like this. Apparently, rook to g2 should have been played, forcing the king to move up the board because of these two pieces covering the first and second rank. And this is what the computer wanted, and at this point it would still be a dead even game. If we go back to what was actually played, let's see why this was a mistake and if Magnus takes advantage of it. The best and only move to keep the advantage here is king to c2. And Magnus finds that move. All right, so the game continues with a check. And now the king is running. Magnus finds another great move. We have another check, and it's pretty crazy. Magnus is ahead by a knight, but rook and queen are checking Magnus's king all over the board. Magnus finds king to a2, an excellent move. Also, king to a1 would be good. But the game continues with check. King moves forward. We have another check. And finally, Gukesh regains his piece. But this is played at the expense of a counterattack by Magnus. So the computer says that queen to c2 to just keep checking would have been better. But even then, the computer gives a winning advantage to Magnus. So let's see how things ended here. Magnus checks the king, and the king is off and running. So we have another check. And the king is moving to the center here. Another check. And now king to e4 is played, but it's not looking good. Magnus finds the best move in the position, delivering another check. And this is where the world champion, resigned or ended the game. He loses here. But let's see why, how the game could continue. The best move would be king to d3, apparently. And that would allow another check. And after, king to d2 or king to c2, the rook could be captured with check. So that Magnus would just be up a rook and still attacking the king. So the only other option would be to go this way, king to c4, but that allows rook to c6, checking, and then taking the queen there. So, no matter what, Magnus would have a huge winning advantage and a mate in 6 to 12 moves. All right. Well, I hope you enjoyed this interesting and pretty epic battle between two of the best players in the world right now. And I thought we could learn a lot from this game because it was a slower time control. If we look at this, wow, Magnus has what, 15 seconds left on the clock? Or is that 15 minutes? No, I think it's 15 seconds, and the opponent has 45. But anyway, great game. I'll probably show more about the Jobava London in the future. So feel free to leave comments, like, and subscribe to support the channel. Thank you for watching, and have a super chess day.